She was 24 when James Whitmore filed. He did not tell her. He did not sit her down across the small oak table they had bought together at an antique fair, the one she had painstakingly refinished. He did not call her. Instead, he had the papers delivered by a courier from his own law firm to the remote Forest Service outpost where she was finishing a 3-week backcountry survey of subalpine fir regeneration. A young ranger, barely 19, had handed her the thick manila envelope with an apologetic shrug, the official seal of the court stark and alien against the backdrop of pine and granite. By the time she had packed her gear, hitched a ride in a logging truck down the mountain, and taken 2 buses back to the city, it was already done. He had been methodical. He had been efficient. The joint bank account, which held the entirety of their shared savings and her last 2 paychecks, was empty. The lease on their apartment, the one with the view of the city she had never quite loved, had been legally transferred to his name alone. Her key no longer worked in the lock. On the polished concrete doorstep, stacked with a lawyer's precision, were her belongings, her field pack, her specialized surveying equipment, 3 boxes of books on forest ecology, and her winter gear. He took the Danish modern sofa. He took the commissioned painting they had bought on their first anniversary. He took the set of German knives and the heirloom silver that had been a wedding gift from his parents. He took everything that had a clear, documented, and appreciable monetary value. He did not know about the ranger station. He had never asked about her grandmother, not really, not in the way that mattered. He had listened to the stories of her childhood summers the way one might listen to a pleasant but forgettable piece of music. So he did not know about the deed, filed away in a county courthouse 200 miles away, to a decommissioned 1950s ranger station and 5 acres of timberland deep in the Cascade Mountains. He had no way to quantify it, no line item on a spreadsheet to account for its worth, so he never thought to look for it. He forgot it existed, because to him it never had. She had grown up understanding the forest the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else entirely. It was a language spoken in the creak of Douglas firs under the weight of wind, the rustle of a vole in the dry undergrowth, the specific, resonant drumming of a pileated woodpecker against a standing dead snag. This understanding was a gift from her grandmother, Ruth Okafor, a woman who had carried the memory of a different kind of green, the dense, humid green of southern Nigeria, all the way to the cool, temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. Selah's connection to this place was not something learned from textbooks, though she had read them all. It was something inherited, a cellular knowledge passed down through stories and shared silences, a legacy written not on paper but in the rings of ancient trees. Ruth had been a force of quiet determination, a woman whose resilience was as deep and patient as the root systems of the old-growth cedars she so admired. She had arrived in America with her husband, a brilliant forestry student, both of them filled with a post-colonial optimism that the world's great forests could be studied, understood, and saved. They had settled in Washington, drawn by the sheer scale of the wilderness, a landscape that felt both vast and intimate. For years they worked together, a partnership of science and spirit, until a sudden illness took Selah's grandfather, leaving Ruth a widow in a country that was not quite hers, with a young son to raise. She did not retreat. She did not return to the family who urged her to come home. Instead, she went deeper into the woods. She took a job with the Forest Service, not as a scientist. The official roles were still largely the domain of men then, but as an administrator, a record keeper, a quiet presence who knew more about the local ecosystems than any of the credentialed men who passed through the regional office. She was methodical, observant, and she possessed the particular quality of patience that comes from watching things grow over decades. The foresters and rangers came to rely on her encyclopedic memory of fire scars from half a century ago, on her uncanny ability to predict the severity of a bark beetle infestation based on the subtle change in the color of the needles on a single hillside. She became a part of the landscape itself, as essential and as overlooked as the mycorrhizal networks connecting the trees beneath the forest floor. When the old ranger station at Hemlock Creek was decommissioned in the late 70s, deemed too remote and too expensive to maintain, Ruth bought it. The Forest Service sold it to her for $1, and the implicit understanding that she would continue to be its steward. It was not an investment in real estate. It was an investment in solitude and purpose. She ran it as an informal wildlife monitoring post, a sanctuary, a place where the line between her life and the life of the forest blurred into nothing. Selah's childhood was mapped by the winding gravel road that led to that station. Every summer, her parents would drive her up into the mountains, leaving her in her grandmother's care for weeks at a time. It was there she learned the names of things, the sharp, citrus scent of grand fir needles, the papery texture of a birch's bark, the difference between the call of a varied thrush and a Swainson's thrush. Ruth taught her not through formal lessons, but through shared work. They mended fences, cleared fallen branches from the creek, and spent long hours in the glass-walled observation room of the fire lookout tower, simply watching. Her grandmother would sit in a worn armchair with a pair of binoculars, making notes in a leather-bound ledger, her handwriting a dense, elegant script. She taught Selah how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find her way by the sun and stars, how to be still enough that the forest would forget she was there and reveal its secrets. Selah learned about resilience not from lectures, but from watching her grandmother split firewood with a steady, practiced rhythm, her movements economical and strong. She learned about value not from price tags, but from the immense, unquantifiable worth of a healthy watershed, a thriving elk herd, a sky dark enough to see the Milky Way. When her grandmother passed away 3 years ago, just as Selah was finishing her undergraduate degree, she left her the station. It was the only thing she had of real material substance, and it was the only thing Selah truly wanted. She had tucked the deed away, a secret promise to herself that one day she would return. She met James in her final year of graduate school. He was a law student, sharp and ambitious, with a confidence that seemed to generate its own gravity. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened to her talk about her research, about the intricate dance between fungal networks and tree health, with a focused intensity that she mistook for genuine interest. He found her quiet competence exotic. He was a man who collected things, degrees, accolades, interesting people. Selah, the serious wildlife biologist with dirt under her fingernails and a faraway look in her eyes, was a fascinating addition to his collection. They moved in together quickly. His world was one of contracts and negotiations, of bottom lines and billable hours. He saw the world as a series of assets to be managed and leveraged. He loved the idea of her work more than the reality of it. He loved telling his colleagues at cocktail parties that his girlfriend was saving the planet. But he wrinkled his nose at the smell of pine sap on her clothes and complained about the mud her boots tracked into the apartment. The chasm between them had been there from the beginning, but she had been too willing to ignore it. The memory that surfaced now, sharp and painful, was of a dinner party a year into their relationship. One of his partners had been talking about a new development project that required clearing a large tract of second-growth forest. Selah had quietly mentioned the importance of contiguous wildlife corridors. James had laughed, a smooth, placating sound. He had put his arm around her and said to the table, "Selah's a purist, but in the real world, leaving that much land undeveloped is just an economically irrational use of resources." He had said it with a smile, as if it were a joke, a fond jab at her idealism. But Selah had heard the cold finality in his words. It was a judgment. In his world, the forest's only value was what it could be sold for once it was cut down. It was then she decided that the ranger station, her grandmother's legacy of irrational love, would remain hers and hers alone. She never spoke of it again. His inability to see its worth was the very thing that had, in the end, saved it for her. She took the last of her cash, $237 that she had tucked into a pocket of her field pack for emergencies, and bought a bus ticket. It was a long journey north, a slow unwinding of the life she had built. The bus moved through sprawling suburbs that gave way to agricultural fields, then finally began to climb into the foothills of the Cascades. With each mile, the concrete and noise of the city receded, replaced by the deep, resonant green of the forest. She sat with her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the trees pass by in a blur. Douglas fir, western hemlock, red cedar. She named them silently to herself, a familiar litany, a grounding ritual. She carried only one large duffel bag filled with her most essential field clothes, and her worn leather field bag containing her binoculars, her journals, and the folded, creased deed to the station. She was stripped down to the barest elements of herself, and with every passing mile, she felt not a sense of loss, but a strange, quiet lightness. James had taken the furniture, the accounts, the shared history he had curated. But he could not touch this. He could not touch the memories of her grandmother's hands showing her how to identify a chanterelle mushroom, or the feeling of the cold mountain air on her face at dawn. He had taken the life they had built together, but he had left her her own. The bus let her off in Skycomish, a small town nestled in a river valley, a place that felt suspended in time. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. She walked to the one-story brick building that housed the office of a local lawyer, a man named Arthur Jensen. He had been a friend of her grandmother's, and his name was listed on the legal documents as the executor of the small estate. He was an old man with kind, watery eyes and a handshake as firm as a tree root. He remembered her from when she was a little girl visiting Ruth. He didn't ask about her sudden appearance or her lack of luggage. He simply looked at her, a long, appraising look, and seemed to understand everything. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice raspy. "She knew the value of things, the real value." He retrieved a large, dusty key from a drawer in his metal desk. It was heavy, made of black iron, and ornate in a simple, functional way. "This is for the main gate. The cabin and the tower use the same key. It's all yours, Sella." Just as she wanted. He facilitated the final transfer of the deed, a simple signing of papers that felt more like a homecoming than a legal transaction. A friend of his, a man who ran the local hardware store, gave her a ride in his pickup truck for the last 10 miles up the winding Forest Service road. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the trees grew thicker, closing in around the road until it felt like a tunnel carved through a living green wall. Finally, they reached a rusted metal gate, and the man helped her with her bags before leaving her in the profound silence of the mountains. She stood before the gate for a long time, the heavy iron key cool in her palm. Then, with a deep breath, she unlocked it. The hinges groaned in protest as she pushed it open. The station was just as she remembered it, only more weathered, more reclaimed by the forest. The main cabin was built of dark, sturdy logs, with a low-pitched green metal roof now dappled with moss. A wide porch ran along the front, its railings softened by lichen. To the side, a small generator shed and a workshop stood sentinel. And rising above it all, on a small knoll behind the cabin, was the fire lookout tower. It was a simple, elegant structure of steel and wood, its glass-walled observation room seeming to float above the canopy of the trees. The place was in a state of benign neglect. Pine needles blanketed the roof. The windows were filmed with a year's worth of dust and pollen, and a shutter on an upper window of the cabin hung from a single hinge. But it was solid. The foundations were stone. The logs were sound. Her grandmother had built things to last. It had, as the foresters like to say, good bones. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and the faint, clean smell of approaching rain. This was the smell of her childhood, the smell of her own history. It was the smell of home. She spent the first day just walking the grounds, reacquainting herself with the landscape of her past. She followed the small creek that ran along the edge of the property, its water clear and cold. She found the patch of wild ginger her grandmother had always harvested for tea. She laid a hand on the rough bark of a massive cedar tree that Ruth had called the Old Man. The place was alive with the ghost of her grandmother's presence. That evening, as dusk settled, she made her way to the lookout tower. She climbed the steep wooden stairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet air. The observation room at the top was a single square space, walled with windows on all four sides, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding ridges and valleys. A firefinder, the brass instrument used to pinpoint the location of smoke, still stood in the center of the room, its metal surface tarnished with age. A built-in cot was folded against one wall, and a small desk with a single chair sat in a corner. It was here that she remembered a story Ruth had told her, a story about keeping things safe. "There are some things you don't put in a bank, Sela," she had said one afternoon as they watched a thunderstorm roll in from the west. "Banks deal in paper. You must find a place of stone." Sela ran her hands along the low stone wall that formed the base of the observation room. She felt for any give, any looseness. Near the corner, behind the desk, one of the flat gray stones shifted slightly under her touch. She worked her fingers into the crack, her heart beginning to beat faster. The stone came free with a gritty scrape. Behind it, in the dark cavity, sat a large, sealed tin box, the kind that used to hold biscuits. It was heavy. She carried it to the center of the room and pried open the lid with the tip of her field knife. Inside, nestled in oiled cloth, were stacks of old bills, held together with brittle rubber bands. 50s and 20s mostly, worn soft with age. Beneath the cash were canvas bags, heavy and clinking. She poured them out onto the floor. Silver coins, Morgan dollars, walking Liberty halves spilled out, their surfaces gleaming dully in the fading light. It was a lifetime of careful, quiet saving, money tucked away from her grandmother's modest salary, a hedge against uncertainty. She didn't count it precisely then, but she could see it was a substantial amount. It was enough. It was enough to begin again. But there was something else in the tin. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of waterproof oilskin, was a letter. It was written on a sheet of old Forest Service survey paper, the grid lines faded to a pale blue. The handwriting was her grandmother's, the familiar, elegant script. Her name was at the top. "My dearest Sela," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have come home, and that you need to. I hope the world has been kind to you, but I know that the world is not always kind. That is why we build things that last. This place, this land, it is not an asset. Do not ever think of it that way. It is a responsibility. It is a sanctuary. Its value cannot be counted in dollars. It can only be measured in breaths of clean air, in the clarity of the water in the creek, in the silence that allows you to hear your own heart. The money I have left is for the practical things. The roof will need new shingles soon. The roofer in town is named Olson. His father was a good man, and so is he. He is honest. The generator will need servicing. But the real inheritance is the forest itself. Learn its rhythms. Let it teach you patience. Let it teach you how to stand firm in the wind. This place will hold you when you feel you cannot hold yourself. It held me. It will always be here for you. All my love, Ruth." Sela sat on the floor of the lookout tower, the letter in her hands, and she wept. She wept for the loss of her grandmother, for the cruelty of James, for the long, hard road that had led her to this room. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, anchoring relief. She was not adrift. She was home. The next morning, she drove into town in the old, barely functional truck her grandmother had left in the workshop. She found Olson's Roofing and Repair in a modest building behind the main street. Mr. Olson was a tall, stooped man in his late 60s with hands as gnarled and tough as cedar roots. He looked at Selah over the top of his glasses, his expression skeptical at first, then softening as she introduced herself. "Ruth Okafor's granddaughter," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'll be. I knew your grandmother for 30 years. She was a force of nature, taught my boy how to identify trees just by their bark." He listened as she explained the state of the station's roof. He nodded, his expression serious. He promised to come out the next day to take a look. True to his word, he arrived the following morning. He spent an hour walking the roofs of the cabin and the workshop, his movements slow but sure. He came down and gave her a quote that she knew, instinctively, was more than fair. "Your grandmother gave me my first big job when I was just starting out," he explained, as if sensing her thoughts. "She paid me what the job was worth, and then a little more, and told me to use it to buy a better ladder. Said a man's safety is worth more than a few dollars. I never forgot that." He offered to let Selah work alongside his small crew to bring the cost down further. "You look like you know how to work," he said, a statement of fact, not a question. The work was hard, but it was honest. For 2 weeks, Selah rose at dawn and climbed the ladder onto the roof of her own home. She learned the rhythmic work of it, the scrape of the pry bar pulling up old, curled shingles, the satisfying thud of the hammer driving in new nails, the smell of hot tar under the summer sun. She worked alongside Olson's 2-man crew, young men from the town who treated her not as a client but as a colleague. They shared coffee from a thermos and talked about fishing and local politics. She felt a simple, uncomplicated belonging that she had never known in the city. Her muscles, already strong from her fieldwork, grew harder. Her hands became calloused. Each evening she would ache with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. She was not just repairing a roof. She was rebuilding the very shelter of her life, nail by nail. The physical labor was a balm, a way to sweat out the bitterness and grief. It left no room for obsessive thoughts, for replaying the final cold months with James. There was only the task at hand, the next shingle, the next nail, the straight line of the chalk mark. When the job was done, the new green metal roof gleamed in the sun, a promise of warmth and safety against the coming winter rains. Mr. Olson shook her hand, his grip firm. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. It was the highest praise she could imagine. With the most critical repair finished, Selah turned her attention to the interior. The station became her sole focus, a project that absorbed all her energy and attention. She spent weeks engaged in the slow, meditative work of reclamation. She scrubbed the log walls until the rich, dark color of the wood emerged from beneath a layer of dust. She washed every window, inside and out, until the forest light poured into the rooms, clear and bright. She pulled up the worn linoleum in the small kitchen, uncovering the original plank flooring underneath. She spent a week sanding it down by hand, then sealing it with oil, the grain of the old-growth fur emerging like a hidden map. The work was methodical, and in its rhythms she found a sense of peace. Each completed task was a small victory, a tangible piece of evidence that she could not only survive but build. She repaired the wood stove, cleaning out the flue and replacing the cracked fire bricks, her grandmother's old instruction manuals guiding her hands. She got the small propane generator in the shed running again, its steady hum a welcome sound in the deep quiet of the evenings. She was not just cleaning a house. She was learning its systems, its mechanics, its unique personality. She was becoming its partner, just as her grandmother had been. She arranged the few pieces of furniture Ruth had left, a sturdy writing desk, a deep armchair, a simple bed frame. She unpacked her books and arranged them on shelves she built herself from salvaged lumber in the workshop. She set up a small corner of the main room as her laboratory, laying out her microscope, her plant presses, and her specimen jars. Slowly, painstakingly, the abandoned station transformed. It ceased to be a relic of her grandmother's life and became the vessel for her own. It was a home, a laboratory, a fortress of solitude. It was hers. As summer began to fade into the crispness of early autumn, the practical need for an income asserted itself. The money her grandmother had left was a miraculous start, but it was finite. She drove into town and went to the local Forest Service district office, a place she knew her grandmother had frequented for years. She introduced herself to the district biologist, a woman named Maria Flores, who was in her 50s with a warm, no-nonsense demeanor. When Selah mentioned her name and the location of her new home, Maria's face broke into a wide smile. Ruth Okafor's granddaughter. Of course, your grandmother was a legend around here. She forgot more about this forest than most of us will ever learn. As it happened, they were looking for a contract biologist for the fall season. The job involved surveying old-growth plots deep in the backcountry, areas that were difficult to access. It was specialized, demanding work that required both scientific expertise and a high degree of self-sufficiency. It was the exact work Selah was trained for. Maria hired her on the spot, dispensing with the usual formalities. "Anyone who could keep up with Ruth Okafor," she said, "is more than qualified to work for me." The job was part-time, 3 days a week, which gave Selah a steady income while leaving her ample time for her own work at the station. It felt like a perfect alignment of fate. Her professional skills, which had felt so abstract and disconnected in the city, now had a direct and meaningful application. She was being paid to do what she loved, in the place she loved most. On her days off, Selah began the work she considered her true calling. She took up her grandmother's informal, lifelong project of cataloging the intricate web of life on the 5 acres surrounding the station. She saw it as a continuation of a conversation that had been interrupted by death. She reopened Ruth's old ledgers, their pages filled with decades of observations on rainfall, snowpack, animal sightings, and the flowering times of native plants. Using her own more formal scientific training, Selah began to build upon that foundation. She established permanent transects for monitoring vegetation change. She set up motion-activated wildlife cameras along the game trails that crisscrossed the property, capturing ghostly nighttime images of black-tailed deer, a shy bobcat, and once, a magnificent cougar moving silently through the ferns. She spent hours in the lookout tower, just as her grandmother had, but with a high-powered spotting scope, mapping the nesting sites of goshawks and owls in the surrounding canopy. The work was slow, patient, and deeply fulfilling. It was a way of honoring her grandmother's legacy while also making it her own. She was not just an observer of this small piece of the world. She was its dedicated chronicler, its student, and its guardian. The forest, which had always been her refuge, now became her life's work, the subject of her study and the source of her sustenance. Word of her presence spread through the small community in the unhurried way that news travels in mountain towns. People who had known and respected her grandmother began to make the journey up the gravel road to the station. They came not as nosy neighbors, but as pilgrims paying their respects. A retired forester named Bill, who had worked with Ruth in the 60s, brought her a perfectly seasoned cast-iron skillet and a jar of huckleberry jam his wife had made. He spent an afternoon with her, walking the property and pointing out trees he and Ruth had marked for a study 40 years earlier, sharing stories of her quiet wisdom and fierce dedication. An elderly botanist, a woman who had corresponded with Ruth for years about rare alpine flowers, came bearing a gift of several heirloom seed packets for a vegetable garden. She helped Selah identify a particularly elusive species of orchid growing by the creek. These visits were quiet affirmations. The community was not just welcoming her. They were recognizing her. They saw her grandmother in the determined set of her jaw, in her deep, observant eyes, in the competent way she handled an axe. They were validating her right to be there, confirming that she was not an outsider who had simply inherited a piece of property, but the rightful heir to a legacy of stewardship. She was Ruth Okafor's granddaughter, and in this small corner of the world, that name was a currency more valuable than any amount of money James Whitmore could have taken from a bank. The confrontation, when it came, happened on a cold September morning. The sky was the color of slate, and the air held the sharp, clean scent of imminent rain. Selah was outside the workshop, splitting rounds of fir for the woodshed, a task she had come to love for its simple, repetitive violence. The rhythmic thud of the axe biting into wood was the only sound, a steady heartbeat in the immense quiet. That was why she heard the car long before she saw it. It was the wrong kind of sound, the low, aggressive purr of a high-performance engine, utterly alien to the usual rumble of pickup trucks and logging equipment. A sleek, dark gray sedan, absurdly clean and low to the ground, picked its way cautiously up the final stretch of the gravel road. It stopped, and James Whitmore got out. He was dressed in a way that was both expensive and completely inappropriate for the setting. He wore a soft, charcoal gray cashmere sweater, tailored trousers, and polished leather shoes that were immediately coated in a film of mud. He looked around, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and something that looked like grudging admiration. He saw the new roof, the clean windows, the neat stacks of firewood. He saw the station not as an abandoned relic, but as a functioning, thriving home. He looked at Selah, her hair tied back, her face smudged with dirt, her body strong and grounded as she stood with the axe in her hands. He seemed to be seeing her for the first time. He walked towards her, picking his way carefully around the muddy patches. Selah did not stop her work. She set another round on the chopping block, lifted the axe, and brought it down with a clean, satisfying crack. The wood split perfectly in two. "Selah," he said. His voice sounded thin in the vastness of the forest. She paused, resting the head of the axe on the block, but did not look at him fully. "James, what are you doing here?" He gestured vaguely at the station, a small, uncertain smile on his face. Some legal paperwork came up. A final property query from the county. I saw the address. I had no idea." She lifted the axe again, swinging it with fluid, practiced motion. Another log split. The sound was sharp and final. "No," she said. "You didn't." He took another step closer, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. "This place is incredible. I guess my due diligence wasn't as thorough as I thought." The words were meant to be a self-deprecating joke, an admission of his own oversight, but they landed with a dull thud. He was still speaking his language of transactions, of legal thoroughness. He still didn't understand. "It's not an asset, James," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of her own breathing. She finally stopped and turned to face him, leaning on the handle of the axe. She felt a profound and surprising calm. There was no anger, no bitterness left. There was only a great, quiet distance between them. He looked at her, at the newfound strength in her shoulders, at the clarity in her eyes. He seemed, for the first time, to recognize the depth of his miscalculation. "Is there—" he started, his voice faltering for a moment. "Is there anything that can be repaired, Selah, between us?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who had spent his life counting the wrong things. She thought of all the years they had been together, all the conversations they had had. He had asked about her research, her career, her opinions on art and politics, but he had never, not once, asked about the grandmother who had shaped her. He had never asked about the source of the quiet resilience he claimed to admire. He had never asked about the forest that was her home. "No," she said. The word was not harsh. It was not angry. It was a simple statement of fact, as undeniable as the mountain behind her. "No, there isn't." He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw the dawning, painful recognition of a loss he was only now beginning to comprehend. He had won the apartment, the bank account, the furniture. He had won everything he thought mattered. He nodded slowly, a single, sharp gesture of defeat. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his immaculate car, and drove away, his taillights disappearing down the road that had brought her home. That night, she climbed the tower. A full moon had risen, casting the forest in a stark and beautiful landscape of silver and black. The air was cold and sharp, and so clear she felt she could see for 100 miles. She sat in the old armchair by the window, wrapped in one of her grandmother's wool blankets, and looked out at the world she had inherited. She saw the endless sea of trees, the dark ridges rolling away into the distance, the silent, powerful presence of the mountains. Down below, a single warm light glowed from the window of her cabin. Her home. She thought about James, about his world of quantifiable value, of assets and liabilities. He had meticulously calculated his share, ensuring he came out ahead in every conceivable metric. He had acted with the cold, rational precision he applied to every part of his life. He had taken everything he could count, everything he could document, everything he could carry. He had secured the lease, the bank accounts, the investments. He had stripped their shared life down to its component parts and taken the ones with the highest market value. She thought about her grandmother, a woman who had built a life on a different kind of accounting. A life measured in seasons, in the health of a forest, in the quiet satisfaction of hard work and self-sufficiency. Ruth had understood that true wealth was not something you could lock in a vault or list on a balance sheet. It was resilience. It was knowledge. It was a deep and abiding connection to a place that asked for nothing but your respect and attention, and in return gave you everything you needed. It was the specific quality of peace that settled over the mountains at dusk. It was the strength in her own arms, the competence in her own hands. James had taken the things he could appraise. He had left behind the only thing that was priceless. He forgot the quiet ranger station her grandmother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.